Hello. In this lecture, we look at pseudoarchaeology involving psychics. What is psychic archaeology? Here we're going to explore how psychics have claimed to be able to help archaeologists locate sites and predict what they will find during the excavation of sites. Later in the module, you'll learn about the variety of techniques that archaeologists use to do these things scientifically without the help of psychics. But here we'll examine what exactly psychic archaeology is and look at the history of these pseudo-archaeological claims. How did psychic archaeology get started? We'll also examine a variety of ways in which psychics have purportedly helped archaeologists. So first, what is psychic archaeology? Psychics, of course, are people who claim to be capable of clairvoyance, which is the ability to see events in the future, fortune tellers, or to have the capabilities of telepathy, right, which is to be able to communicate beyond the natural realm, beyond the known senses. So psychic archaeology, then, is the application of these paranormal phenomena used by psychics to the archaeological record. These techniques include things like automatic writing, dowsing, channeling, psychometry, and so on. Next, we'll review what these different techniques entail, who the major proponents of these methods have been historically, and what types of archaeological questions that they have attempted to address with the help of psychics. So let's first look at the example of automatic writing. Automatic writing is a supposed act of writing on behalf of another otherworldly being. So here you can see in this depiction, the woman is writing, her hand is doing the writing, but she claims that the ghost of someone from another time or dimension is the person who is guiding her hand. He is the one who is directing the writing, and she supposedly has no conscious involvement in the act. So here is a definition, quote, writing said to be produced by a spiritual, occult, or subconscious agency rather than by the conscious intention of the writer. So how have people claimed that automatic writing could be used in archaeology? One person, Mr. Frederick Bly Bond, an Englishman, claimed to have used automatic writing to determine where would be the best location to conduct an archaeological excavation. Mr. Bly Bond was born in 1864 in Wiltshire, England. He studied architecture and he constructed multiple schools, as well as a number of houses and a hospital. He also helped to restore a number of historical English churches, and so he became an expert on historical church architecture. Mr. Bly Bond served as the director of excavations at Glastonbury Abbey between 1908 and 1921. Here you can see a picture of Glastonbury Abbey. This was a monastery during the 7th through the 14th centuries, and it was the second wealthiest during the 14th century of all the abbeys. This abbey has long been connected to myths and legends, including the legend that King Arthur, who is a famous and perhaps mythical warrior king, was buried at the location. Mr. Bly Bond had always been fascinated with the legends of King Arthur, and so Bly Bond excavated in many areas of the Glastonbury Church itself and in some of the other main buildings of the monastery. What is unusual about Bly Bond's work is that he relied on a medium, Captain John Allen Bartlett, and on automatic writing to determine where he should place his excavation pits. Captain Bartlett was said to communicate with the long-deceased peoples of the past who had once lived in the Glastonbury Abbey, such as monks from the medieval ages and others. Bly Bond would ask these spirits questions about Glastonbury, And then the spirits would supposedly reply to him through the hand of Bartlett, through this automatic writing. So Bartlett said that the spirits used his hand to write responses and draw plans, such as the one you can see here. Bly Blond said that he used this information to determine where to dig his archaeological trenches. Before he reported this use of supernatural phenomena to the scientific community, his actual archaeological work, his excavation techniques, were widely respected before this was reported. So did Bartlett and Bly Blond really communicate with medieval monks in this way? Probably not. Analysis of the words and phrases that they supposedly said include many modern phrases that were not in use during those early periods, as we know from the written literature and history. Another technique of psychics that some have attempted to apply to the archaeological record is called channeling. Channeling is similar to automatic writing in that it is supposed to be a way to communicate with the otherworldly spirits. But rather than the spirits just grabbing onto the medium's hand to jot down words and sketches, as in automatic writing, in channeling, the spirit is usually said to enter the medium's body and then to communicate to them from within their own body. A famous example of the connection of channeling and archaeology comes from the work of an American named Edgar Cayce. Cayce was a contemporary of Bly Blond. He was born in 1877 and died in 1945. He was from Kentucky. As a child, he is reported to have seen and communicated with several ghost-like beings, and he is described as a mystic. His profession was photography, said to have gone into his trade after he lost his voice, but then he reportedly later recuperated his voice through hypnosis. He became famous for something known as trance healing. He would predict a person's illnesses using this method and then suggest a remedy for them. In the 1920s, Cayce founded what he named the Association for Research and Enlightenment, which was dedicated to helping people improve their lives by giving them his psychic readings. Cayce's relation to archaeology comes from these readings. So he believed that people were reincarnated, and he claimed to use channeling to learn about people's previous lives, many of which he claimed had ties to the lost city of Atlantis. But given what you've learned previously about Atlantis as a fictional creation of Plato, you should immediately be skeptical of this, right? Do you think that Cayce's connections are good evidence that Atlantis once existed? His descriptions of this lost civilization and the story of its demise sound very close to the stories from Ignatius Donnelly's writings on Atlantis, suggesting that Donnelly was most likely Cayce's real connection to this lost city. Another technique that psychics have claimed can be useful in archaeology is something called dowsing. Dowsing is said to be a way to locate water or objects that are below ground. So a divining rod or pendulum, like you can see here, is held while a person walks. And then when the rod or the pendulum moves, something is thought to be located below the ground in that spot. A famous example of an attempt to use dowsing in archaeology is a survey that was conducted by Karen in 1981 in Point Cook, Australia. Using these dowsing rods, Hunt mapped a site from the late 1800s near this Point Cook, Australia. She claimed that she could use dowsing to determine where the structures of the site, which are now no longer visible, where they were located. In all, Hunt mapped 129 structures, including a house and associated buildings, a windmill, tank, fences, and so on. It's difficult to test her claim because the structures are now gone. She declined to participate in a scientific test of her method. Skeptics point out that the style of the structures that she mapped is much closer to American architectural features of the late 1800s rather than that of colonial period Australia. Yet another psychic technique claimed to be useful to archaeology is psychometry. Psychometry is when a psychic can supposedly tell the history of a person or an event by touching objects that were once associated with the person or that event. For example, by holding the necklace of a now deceased woman, a psychic could supposedly use psychometry to understand what that woman's life was like, or something about her life, or something that happened to her that was linked through the object, through the necklace. An archaeologist named Dr. J. Norman Emerson claimed to use psychometry to enhance his archaeological research. Dr. Emerson was born in 1917 and passed away in 1978. He was Canadian from Toronto, and he studied sociology as an undergraduate before he pursued his graduate studies in anthropology and archaeology. He worked at the University of Toronto for many years and directed actually over 50 different field projects in the Ontario area. Dr. Norman started his career as a well-respected scientist, but in the 1970s, Emerson embraced psychic archaeology. In particular, he asked psychics to use artifacts that he had discovered during his excavations, to use psychometry to tell him about the peoples and events associated with objects in the past. This work, of course, was not accepted as sound research by the scientific community, but it did influence a few others to promote the use of psychic methodologies in archaeology. Among those whose interest was piqued by Dr. Emerson's work was Stephen A. Schwartz. Schwartz received graduate training in archaeology and is now quite a prolific author. His first book in 1978 is titled The Secret Vaults of Time, and this book seeks to introduce archaeologists to the practice of using psychics in archaeological research. In the book, he attempts to convince archaeologists of the validity of these techniques, and he suggests ways to design their research using psychic methods and test their results. In addition to Schwartz, another man named Jeffrey Goodman was also inspired by Dr. Emerson. Chances are that he probably met Stephen Schwartz because they both attended the University of Arizona for a time, and their books are actually nearly identical. Goodman's book on this subject is called Psychic Archaeology: Time Machine to the Past, and it was actually published the year before Schwartz's in 1977. Of archaeologists to what he views as. Goodman also describes his own use of psychics during an excavation at a site near Flagstaff, Arizona. Goodman claimed to find earlier than expected artifacts after he consulted a psychic and on the basis of his own dreams. He never formally published the results of these excavations and discoveries for scientific review. Instead, he only mentions them in various sporadic points in his books. He claims to have found stone tools dating to 125,000 years ago, which, as you'll recall, is much, much earlier than any other reported evidence of human occupation in the Americas. So not surprisingly, these claims are not accepted by the archaeological community. Oops, spoiler alert here. So let's just review briefly this lecture. To summarize, you should now be able to explain what psychic archaeology is and describe several methods used by psychics that have been claimed to be useful to archaeology. You should also be able to explain how these techniques have been purported to have been applied to the archaeological record, as well as why they do not align with the scientific method. Hopefully, it's now clear that psychics cannot actually be of help to archaeologists. This myth, of course, is busted. We'll next talk about the ways that archaeologists have in their toolkit to scientifically identify hidden sites and locate features below the ground in ways that are actually scientifically sound.